Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX. I'm Rishabh Gulati. For the past several weeks, there's been a very intriguing case that's been going on in the United Kingdom. It pertains to the declassification of certain redacted records in the possession of universities and archives in England that are, in essence, the diaries of Louis Mountbatten, who was, of course, India's last viceroy and first governor general. The reason these are particularly important is because here is an individual who, him and his family, were at the hierarchy of affairs, at the top of affairs in India in the complicated period, and I say that as an understatement, of independence and partition. Death, carnage, the drawing of borders, and the partition of India happened in this time. For a country 80 years after independence, still unable to resolve issues germinated at that point of time, how do we shine bright sunshine and tell the story accurately? We can do so if we knew what happened. And a part of that story lies in the handwritten notes and the diaries kept by Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife, Edwina. Now, we have the privilege of joining us on the telecast, Andrew Lownie. He is an author. He's just come out with a book called Traitor King, which is on the Duchess of Windsor, which has been published this year. And a couple of years ago, he published a book on the Mountbattens, looking at what happened in their lifetime, including that time here in India. Andrew Lownie, why did you pick Edwina and Louis Mountbatten as a subject that interested you as a biographer?
Well, I was very interested in the portrait of the marriage because it was a very unusual marriage that they had this very public role together, but they had led very separate lives in terms of their private lives. I could see that they were very important figures. They really were at all the major points of history in terms of for us and the British, the social life and the royal life of the 1920s and 30s through to his wartime career as Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia, and then, as you say, as the last Viceroy. And I felt that the books had been written about them in the past had always been authorized, and there was scope to tell the real story from an independent historian. And I found there was a lot more to say, a lot had been covered up. And they were a very intriguing couple. There were lots and lots of secrets. There were lots of hidden lives in their lives. And therefore, a fascinating subject for a biographer.
Okay, where is the line between what is, salacious and scandalous versus what really is of dramatic historical significance?
Well, I've wanted access to these diaries and letters since I started researching the book in 2015. And I wanted them because they've been quoted extensively in the authorized books and indeed by previous authors who'd had access to them. And diaries and letters are the seed, what we need, the seeds for a biographer to construct a story, to know who they saw, what they did, what they felt. And normally one does have access to these sort of diaries and letters if they've been kept. And the role of the historian is to tell the story of what happened in the past. Now, I'm a serious historian. I was a fellow of Cambridge College. I'm not in the business of gossip. But I think in the case of Edwina, it is very important to know when her relationship with Nehru began and how far that may have had some impact on bigger political matters like independence and partition. So I think, this sort of detail is of interest. But, there is a principle here, apart from just the importance of the archive, that governments should not be preventing access to archives. These diaries and letters were bought with British taxpayers' money for £4.5 million in 2011 to be made available to scholars because they were seen to be an important archive. And
okay, sorry to interject you. Can you just tell us a bit of the story for viewers watching here in India? So you decide to write a book, which is a biography. You've read the official accounts, the accounts that have come from the family as well. And you want access to the diaries and the letters. What happens next?
Well, I'm told that they know nothing about the diaries and letters, which I know is not true. And so I go through the various procedures, through the FOI requests, writing to government departments. And eventually the Information Commissioner, which is the person responsible in this country for enforcing these actions, ordered the Southampton to release these diaries and letters. In fact, they found them in contempt of court for ignoring their instructions in the past. It's complicated because the Cabinet Office have claimed some sort of role in this, because claiming that Mountbatten gave an undertaking that this material would be vetted before it was released. Anyway, the decision was made in 2019, they should be released to me. And the appeal hearing in November was the appeal brought by the Cabinet Office and the Southampton to prevent or to challenge this and say it shouldn't be released.
In fact, what is the basis? Did they ever give you anything, redacted versions, or they handed over nothing?
Well, their first position was that nothing should be released, that it was subject to undertakings he gave in 1969. They then, when they were shown that that was not correct, then changed their line in the hearing in November to, so no role for the Cabinet Office whatsoever, that they just had to do redactions under the Freedom of Information exemptions. So these would include Section 27, which relate to international relations. Their argument was this would deeply affect relations with India and Pakistan. Section 37, which relates to the privacy of the royal family, and also Section 23 and 22, which relate to national security. And they have, over the last few months, quietly, without saying anything, released about 99% of the diaries and letters, which show them to be completely innocuous. I'm afraid they have no great revelations or sensational revelations, but they are holding fire on 1,000 pages, which they have redacted, claiming exemptions under those three categories. Now, we've been able to challenge some of those redactions because we know the context, to show that much of this material already is in the public domain, that there is no challenge to national security with, for example, acronyms from the Second World War. And that just because Edwina wrote in a diary that she thought Jinnah was an awful man doesn't affect relations with India and Pakistan.
Okay, so where do things stand now? Where is the appeal in progress?
Well, the appeal took place in November. It didn't need to take place. They continued to bring this appeal. Even though most of the material had been released. I think it was all about basically, and of course the appeal cost me another £50,000. It must have cost them at least another 100,000. Totally unnecessary, but I had no choice. I had to respond to it. But they were just, I think, trying to make the point that they didn't want anyone to challenge them. They had to go through a face-saving exercise and to try and keep something back, because the reality is that everything is innocent. And they want to make an example.
So do you suspect there is something difficult to find? Why should we be curious about the redacted papers?
Well, it's very difficult to know what one doesn't know. One can only surmise that there is critical information about Jinnah. There is more information about the relationship with Nehru and when it began. That there is material, for example, about how unpartial they were in dealings, for example, with Cyril Radcliffe, who drew up the partition plans. But one can only guess, because many of the redactions relate only to the royal family here. They relate to names of staff in the royal household, the valets, often who are in the public domain already, often of whom written books. They relate to mentions of going to stay at Windsor. So nothing to do with India and Pakistan. But the few references that are there under Section 27, one can only assume have something, but there's nothing so far that suggests it's sensational. And the irony is that by holding this back, they raise expectations that there is something important and create far more controversy than there probably needs to be.
So is this a circular trap where at a point of principle you think the argument is now being extended, or
yes,
is there because that there is something that is relevant and the British government would not like to see in the public domain?
Well, we don't know. That is the answer. We don't know because it's difficult to tell from the redactions what they've redacted. But from the evidence so far, it looks completely innocent. These are, after all, remember, very small diaries where they just recorded their day-to-day meetings, and the letters are between them are about their own private lives. They don't really impinge on their public lives. So, I mean, there is material clearly that's been weeded that relates to India and Pakistan from their official papers, but I think these are completely innocent. So I think it's a face-saving exercise that, having been caught out holding back material that they had no right to hold back, they're trying to justify it. And I think there's also a deference to the royal family. And so any reference to the British royal family has been taken out, even though it's completely innocent. And I think there is an element that I'm to be made an example of, that no historian should dare challenge the government about what they do, because they do censor history. A lot of our documents are censored and destroyed.
How do we get past? Because the acts that are ironically applicable in Britain, the exact same duplicates are applicable here. We are still under an Official Secrets Act on the release of documents. Is there a need to review that the documents, both in the British archives in India House and from here in India, should be released so that historians and biographers can actually put together a more accurate picture of very tumultuous events?
Yes, of course. I think that's what all historians would want, and all citizens would want. They'd want transparency. We have a public, certainly in Britain, a Public Records Act, which requires information, unless it's very sensitive, to be released into the National Archives. I think, sadly, the government have actually stepped backwards in terms of freedom of information legislation and are much more reluctant to release material that really they, strictly speaking, should release. So all we can rely on is media pressure and the legal system. But I think that even the law courts are too deferential to, for example, the royal family or worries about national security. And it needs diplomatic pressure, for example, from India and Pakistan on this matter. We need to raise the issue in the media. It was only because of media pressure that the government indeed released anything. I've been fighting for 4 years for these documents to be released. And then suddenly they were released without any problems at all.
Mr. Lownie, in public perception, where you're sitting, is there an understanding of how much these events of these intervening years that pertain to the life of Lord Mountbatten and his wife are still so relevant in Indian current affairs?
Yes, of course. I mean, we have the anniversary of partition next year. There are going to be books and television programs. Indeed, the archivist who closed the collection has arranged with the government to edit his own version of the 1947 diary, which is extraordinary. So access has been prevented for everyone else except the person who closed the archive in the first place. And my own view is that you can't have cozy relationships like that. Archives are either open to everyone or closed. But yes, of course. And, you know, my book, which is published in 2019, so I'm fighting this battle, not for my own interest, but because I think there are important principles at stake. But my own book related to how there was a huge cover-up about, for example, Mountbatten's secret bisexual life, his paedophile activities, that much of the information, even dealing with his public life, had been suppressed. His involvement, for example, in a coup in 1968. Because we've had a curated history, which has just been approved versions of his story, rather than independent historians going into the archives and using the documents to tell the story. And documents, of course, are our lifeblood.
To digest in the UK, a beloved, almost uncle to the Queen. How easy it is, even in 2021, to digest uncomfortable facts about the Mountbattens.
Well, I think there's still this deference. But I think, the fact is that every day in the papers, there is criticism of the royal family relating to either Prince Andrew or Prince Harry. We've had stories recently about Prince Charles selling honours for cash for his charities. So I think the press are more prepared to challenge the curated story that the royals present. I think there was a very important decision in favour of Meghan Markle the other day, that she had a right to privacy, because it's very clear that she has been working the press with sympathetic biographers and journalists to tell her own version of events, which is not the truth. And this is a suppression of free speech and of free media. And this is what's been happening with the Mountbatten diaries as well. You know, historians have to be given access to all the documents. You said that you made the point in the previous program on this subject yourself, I think, very well, one of your interviewees, that historians need to be able to look at everything to tell the story properly.
Ms. Lownie, what did you find in the course of writing the book that you published in 2019?
Well, my book was a bestseller in Britain, and in fact, I'm coming to speak at the Jaipur Festival about it in January. And it revealed a completely different version of events to the official biographies that have been published. It showed that he was a far less effective, I mean, many stories that, of course, you in India know already, but that he was a far less effective military leader than he liked to claim. That he had, as I say, this secret private life that he covered up, which was illegal at the time. He could have gone to prison. He would certainly have been thrown out of the Navy. There are suggestions that he may well have been blackmailed. He may well have been operating as a Soviet agent under the codename Admiral. That he did not make a great success of partition independence, but that was covered up. That he was not a Democrat, that he was involved in a potential coup in 1968 against the British government. There were lots and lots of stories about him that had never come out before, which I found by looking at the archives.
And these stories were coming out of where? They're coming out of secondary sources?
No, they're coming out of primary sources.
Document, like I said, that has some realm of further investigation required, rather than just salaciousness.
Well, I don't operate on that basis. I operate on primary research, and the book had literally thousands of footnotes. For example, I found his FBI file, which named his paedophile activities. I had found material in foreign archives, which had not been weeded. I found material in people's private papers and correspondence. I think what was interesting about the FBI files is that when I asked for further FBI files, other files linked to his file, I was told that the files had been destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I was told after I'd requested them. So they'd been kept in the American archives until 2017, and then they'd been destroyed, presumably at the request of the British government, when they realized that they were there.
Okay. I wish we had longer time to discuss this, and we'll return to this as often as is required. But Andrew Lownie, would you find it strange that the inability sometimes in England for a much romanticized, a beloved figure like Louis Mountbatten, that the same applies in India? That a lot of people here also look at him as a romanticized, benevolent figure, and don't really want to go into all the things that you've gone into?
Well, I suspect of all they have to go on is what's been presented to them so far. Yes, I mean, the story with Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson, which I've just published, the pictures of a great love match, which is not the case. And I think, again, conclusively proved through primary research in the archives that, they were trapped in a marriage that certainly she didn't want, that she'd been emotionally blackmailed into, and that he, he hadn't been an innocent dupe, but had actually been an active intriguer with the Nazis, who would have been prepared to come back to Britain as a Nazi leader, should the Germans have placed him on the throne. So the problem, as I keep saying with all my books, is we don't know the true history of our past because it's censored, and it's censored because the documents are destroyed. I mean, one of the
it's censored because it's uncomfortable, and the bottom line in all of this seems to be that there might be nothing in the few hundred pages that are left in these diaries, and they might just be innocent and innocuous. If so, good to know, and the rest of us move on. Or there indeed might be something. Regardless, if you shine light on it, we'll all know better, and we'll be less suspicious. There is a spark of imagination that has struck here, both from the many people who would have read Andrew Lownie's book and from the fact that at the highest levels of British government, they seem to be very keen for some reason not to release these pages. Now, that could be face saving, that could be, sticking to a point of principle, or it could be that there is something to hide. We won't know until we know. Andrew Lownie, thanks very much for at least taking up this case and writing a very revealing book that makes us, perhaps forces us to look at certain figures in our history that we have sort of seen as benevolent, romantic sort of figures, much in our popular culture, in our art, in our cinema. That's how the Mountbattens are viewed. And perhaps a more deeper understanding is required of the faults, the humanity, as well as the unpleasant things that they might have been involved in. Andrew Lownie, we wish you the best with the rest of the process. And we hope that by the time you head down to India, there's some good news coming out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.